All right, strap in, everyone. Today we're tackling a real medical head-scratcher, Diamond Blackfan Anemia. We all know our bodies are constantly making new blood cells, but with DBA, it's like the directions for making red blood cells got, well, messed up, right at the protein-making stage.
Yeah, and you know what's really fascinating about DBA? It's incredibly specific. You see, it's not just any anemia, it's this very targeted inability to produce red blood cells, the very cells that carry oxygen throughout our blood.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. I mean, to really wrap our heads around what goes wrong in DBA, we first need to visualize how red blood cells are usually made, right? And it all starts in this hidden world, buzzing with activity, the bone marrow.
Absolutely. Think of it like a bustling city, with all these specialized districts. In one district, you've got stem cells, the ultimate multitaskers, capable of becoming any blood cell type. But when they get a particular signal, erythropoietin, some of those stem cells get a special memo.
Something like, hey, we need more oxygen carriers over here.
Exactly. And it's at that point that those stem cells begin this incredible journey of transformation, a multi-step process we call erythropoiesis.
So it's not like an instant makeover. These cells go through like a whole training montage to become red blood cells.
Exactly. They progress from these early progenitor cells to recognizable precursors like erythroblasts. And all along the way, they're steadily accumulating hemoglobin.
Hemoglobin, of course, being the superstar molecule that gives blood its color and lets it transport oxygen throughout the body.
That's right. It's what makes red blood cells so good at grabbing oxygen from the lungs and, delivering it to every nook and cranny of the body.
It's really mind-blowing when you realize that this process is happening nonstop. We're talking about millions of new red blood cells being made every single second.
It truly is a marvel of nature. Each red blood cell has a lifespan of about 120 days, and in that time, it'll travel thousands of miles delivering oxygen. But, the bone marrow ensures there's always a fresh supply, replacing those aging cells, keeping everything running smoothly.
All right, so we've got this picture of normal erythropoiesis, this beautifully tuned system. But in DBA, there's a wrench in the gears. And that wrench, if I'm understanding this correctly, is a tiny structure called a ribosome.
You got it. Remember those protein-making machines we were talking about? Well, in DBA, the ribosomes and red blood cell precursors, they've got a glitch. It's as if they're trying to follow a corrupted blueprint.
So the bone marrow is trying its best to make red blood cells, but the instructions are faulty, leading to this very specific shortage of red blood cells.
Exactly. And this defect is often present right from birth, which explains why DBA typically shows up so early in life. The marrow's putting in the work, but it just can't produce those vital red blood cells effectively.
And that's a really important distinction, right? Because it helps us understand why DBA is fundamentally different from anemias that might just cause a temporary drop in red blood cell production.
Absolutely. Think about it this way. Sometimes you hear about, say, a viral infection temporarily wiping out someone's blood production. Well, that's kind of like transient erythroblastopenia of childhood, or TEC.
So in tech, it's as if the bone marrow hits the pause button, but the instructions for making red blood cells are still there.
Exactly. Once the infection clears, production picks up again. But with DBA, the problem isn't a passing storm. It's actually built into the very blueprint of the cell.
That's pretty heavy stuff. It's like comparing a software glitch that a simple reboot can fix to a hardware problem that needs a whole new part.
That's a great way to put it, and it really highlights why understanding the root cause of anemia is so crucial. It tells us if we're dealing with a temporary blip or a fundamental flaw in the system.
So we've established how normal red blood cell production works and how this specific ribosomal defect in DBA throws everything off. But the blood cell factory is a complex place. And there are other conditions that can cause anemia, right? Sometimes even affecting more than just the red blood cell lineage.
Absolutely. If normal blood cell production is like this perfectly coordinated orchestra, there are disorders where the entire orchestra starts playing out of tune.
Meaning multiple cell lines in the marrow are affected.
Precisely. Think of Fanconi anemia, or FA, for example. This condition arises from defects in DNA repair pathways. It's almost as if the quality control system in the factory breaks down and errors start popping up everywhere.
So it's not just the red blood cells that are affected, but white blood cells and platelets too, because the problem lies at the DNA level.
Right. And this often results in a much broader range of symptoms. Children with FA might have unusual skin pigmentation, skeletal abnormalities, and even an increased risk of certain cancers.
That's a pretty stark contrast to DBA, where the defect seems mainly focused on red blood cells, at least initially.
Another example is Schwachman-Diamond syndrome, or SDS. This condition typically combines bone marrow failure, often with low white blood cell counts, with problems in the pancreas and skeletal anomalies. Again, a multisystem disorder, unlike DBA's more targeted effects.
So these comparisons help us really appreciate DBA's unique presentation. Like if a child has severe anemia, but their white blood cells and platelets are normal, that's a big clue, right?
Absolutely. It's a sign that points us in the right direction for diagnosis. Think of it like seeing a car with a flat tire. You immediately know the problem's probably with the tire, not the entire engine. Each blood disorder has its own unique pattern, and recognizing that pattern is key to, unlocking the underlying cause.
Okay, so we've talked about how DBA differs from those transient anemias, like TEC, and from more systemic marrow failures, like FA or SDS. Now let's zoom in on a common feature we see in DBA macrocytosis.
Macrocytosis, basically having larger than normal red blood cells, is a fascinating clue in DBA. But it's so important to remember that it's not unique to this condition. You can think of it like a fever. Many things can cause a fever.
So it's a symptom, not the diagnosis itself. We have to look at the bigger picture to figure out why those red blood cells are oversized.
Exactly. Take, for instance, nutritional anemias. If someone's lacking folate or vitamin B12, which are essential for DNA synthesis, their red blood cells can become macrocytic. It's like trying to build a house with too few bricks. You end up with fewer, larger, and, well, incomplete structures.
So in those cases, macrocytosis is caused by, missing building blocks. But with DBA, it's a different story, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. In DBA, it's actually a consequence of those faulty ribosomes. Those tiny factories are vital for making all the proteins a cell needs. And when they malfunction, it disrupts cell division, leading to, well, fewer, larger red blood cells.
So it's like the assembly line keeps jamming because the tools are broken, and as a result, you get these oversized, incomplete cells.
Exactly. But there's another condition with macrocytosis that we need to distinguish from DBA myelodysplastic syndrome, or MDS.
That sounds a bit ominous.
It can be. In MDS, there's a much more widespread disruption in blood cell production. It's like the entire factory is in chaos. Genetic abnormalities cause the production lines to go haywire. You end up with a mix of different cell types, many of them abnormal, and some of those red blood cells can be macrocytic.
So it's like a chaotic scene with the factory churning out all these defective products.
That's a good way to picture it. This distinction is absolutely critical because the treatments for nutritional anemias, DBA, and MDS are totally different.
So if it's a nutritional deficiency, you just need to replenish those missing nutrients. But if it's DBA, you might need corticosteroids, transfusions, or even a stem cell transplant. And if it's MDS, well, treatment often involves chemotherapy or other interventions to control that abnormal cell growth.
Exactly. So even though macrocytosis might look the same on a blood test, the underlying cause can be vastly different. That's why it's so important to investigate further and not just treat the symptom.
Okay, so we've tackled macrocytosis. It's a frequent finding in DBA, but also present in, nutritional deficiencies and more serious conditions like MDS. Now let's explore a group of disorders that highlight the very intricate nature of red blood cell production, the congenital dyserythropoietic anemias, or CDAs.
These are really intriguing disorders because instead of red blood cell production being halted like in DDA, the process actually goes awry, producing defective cells. Imagine baking a cake but accidentally using salt instead of sugar. The cake might look all right, but it definitely won't taste right.
That's a great analogy. So in CDAs, the instructions for making the red blood cells are basically garbled, leading to these abnormal cells with strange shapes or dysfunctional components.
Exactly. The factory is running, but it's producing faulty products. And there are actually several types of CDAs, each with its own unique genetic signature and, specific set of defects.
So for instance, in CDA type I, you might see these odd bridges connecting developing red blood cells, almost as if they didn't separate correctly during cell division.
And in CDA type 2, the red blood cells have altered sugar molecules on their surface, which makes them behave strangely in some lab tests.
So even though both CDAs and DBA cause anemia, the mechanism is completely different, right?
That's right. In DBA, it's as if someone hit the stop button early in production, leading to very few mature red blood cells. But in CDAs, the process keeps going, churning out these wonky, unusable cells that are often destroyed prematurely.
So it's like comparing a factory that's shut down to one that's producing defective products.
Exactly. And
Okay.
this comparison really highlights the many ways red blood cell production can falter. It's not just about whether cells are made, but also whether they're made correctly.
Both DBA and CDAs really emphasize that even a seemingly straightforward process like making blood cells is surprisingly complex and prone to, well, disruptions at multiple points.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another layer of complexity, the role of metabolism and those tiny powerhouses inside our cells, the mitochondria.
Okay, we're getting down to the nitty-gritty here.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate how this deep dive is constantly expanding our understanding of, like, how much needs to go right for our bodies to function properly. Tell me more about these metabolic and mitochondrial influences.
It's fascinating because even with perfectly functioning ribosomes and an intact blueprint for red blood cell production, problems can still pop up elsewhere in the cell, messing up the process.
So it's like having all the right ingredients in the recipe, but the oven's broken. You can't bake a cake without a functioning oven.
That's a fantastic analogy. A perfect example is Pearson-Marrow pancreas syndrome. It's a rare mitochondrial disorder where the problem lies within the mitochondria, those energy factories of the cell.
The mitochondria are crucial for a whole host of cellular functions, right? Not just energy production.
You got it. They're involved in everything from cell signaling to programmed cell death. And in Pearson syndrome, those defects in mitochondria lead to problems not only in the bone marrow, but also in the pancreas.
So it's a multi-system disorder, kind of similar to what we were discussing earlier.
It is. And in the bone marrow, you see this specific type of anemia called sideroblastic anemia. It's characterized by these iron-laden cells called ring sideroblasts. Basically, these are red blood cell precursors packed with iron, but they can't use it effectively to make hemoglobin.
So it's like having a car with a full gas tank but a broken engine. It can't use that fuel.
Precisely. And this contrasts with DBA in a very interesting way. In DBA, the issue is with the ribosomes, so cells can't even get to the point of incorporating iron correctly. But in sideroblastic anemias, the cells take up the iron, but the mitochondria just can't use it to make hemoglobin.
So it's like two different breakdowns on the production line. One stops the process early on, and the other lets it continue, but makes faulty products.
Exactly. And this really emphasizes the interconnectedness of all these cellular processes. You need functioning ribosomes to build proteins, but you also need healthy mitochondria to provide the energy and metabolic pathways to make sure everything runs smoothly.
It's a delicate balance, for sure. We've gone from the ribosome being the main culprit to realizing that even when it's working perfectly, things can still go wrong further down the line, disrupting red blood cell production.
That's right. It's like realizing that even with a perfectly designed engine, a car can still break down if there's a problem with the spark plugs or the battery.
Okay, so we've explored how internal problems within the cells themselves can hinder red blood cell production. But what about external factors that might impact the bone marrow environment, where these cells are made?
That's a crucial point. The bone marrow isn't just this collection of cells. It's actually a complex three-dimensional environment with its own structure and a very delicate balance. And certain conditions can actually create a hostile environment within the bone marrow, disrupting blood cell production from the outside in.
So it's like having a factory that's perfectly capable of making products, but then a flood or an earthquake comes along and damages the building.
Exactly. A brilliant analogy. Let's look at some specific examples. Gaucher disease and Niemann-Pick disease are lysosomal storage disorders. In these conditions, certain types of fats, or lipids, accumulate inside cells, including those in the bone marrow.
And if I remember correctly, lysosomes are like the recycling centers of the cell, breaking down those waste products.
Exactly. But in these disorders, the lysosomes can't break down these specific lipids, so they build up and start crowding the marrow, which ends up disrupting normal blood cell production. It's as if the factory floor is becoming cluttered with waste, making it really hard for the workers to do their jobs.
So it's not that the cells themselves are faulty, but the environment they're in becomes unsuitable.
Precisely. Another example is osteopetrosis. It's also known as marble bone disease. In this condition, bones become incredibly dense and brittle because the cells that are responsible for breaking down old bone just aren't working properly.
So instead of being this dynamic, constantly remodeling tissue, the bones just become overly thick and crowded, squeezing the marrow space.
Exactly. It's like the factory walls are closing in, leaving less room for the machinery and workers. And this crowding can significantly impair red blood cell production.
Wow. So even though these conditions might seem completely unrelated to DBA, they all emphasize how important a healthy bone marrow environment is for proper blood cell production.
That's right. In DBA, the defect is within the red blood cell progenitors themselves. But in these infiltrative or architectural disorders, the problem lies in that surrounding environment, creating this hostile space for those cells to grow and mature.
It's a good reminder that the marrow isn't just a bag of cells. It's a complex, structured organ with its own unique needs and vulnerabilities.
Precisely. And that brings us to a final group of disorders that broaden our understanding of how anemia can arise. Those with wider systemic ties, often involving the immune system or, broader genetic instability.
Okay, so now we're talking about conditions where anemia is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The bone marrow's problems are like connected to issues in other parts of the body.
Exactly. A prime example is reticular dysgenesis. It's a severe form of combined immunodeficiency, or SCID. In this condition, the defect in stem cells is so profound that the marrow really struggles to produce any blood cells at all.
So it's as if the factory has lost its entire workforce and everything comes to a standstill.
A good analogy. The immune system is severely compromised because the body just can't produce the white blood cells needed to fight infections. Red blood cell production is drastically reduced too, leading to severe anemia.
So unlike DBA, where the defect primarily targets those red blood cell progenitors, in reticular dysgenesis, the entire hematopoietic system is affected right from the very foundation.
Precisely. And this distinction really underscores the importance of understanding the hierarchy of blood cell development. You see, in DBA, the problem is further down the line, specifically in cells that are committed to becoming red blood cells. But in reticular dysgenesis, the defect is at the very top, in the stem cells that give rise to all blood cell lineages.
It's like a problem with the CEO, as opposed to an issue in a specific department. One impacts the whole company, while the other has just localized effects.
Exactly. We see similar systemic connections in other disorders, like ataxia-telangiectasia, which is a complex genetic condition with, various features. This includes immune deficiency, neurological problems, and an increased risk of cancer.
And anemia can be a part of that clinical picture.
It can, because the underlying defect in ataxia-telangiectasia involves DNA repair mechanisms. It can lead to problems in any rapidly dividing cell population, including those in the bone marrow. So, while the primary defect isn't specifically targeting red blood cell production, it can still contribute to anemia as a, secondary consequence.
It's another reminder that the bone marrow doesn't exist in isolation.
Yeah.
It's part of a larger interconnected system, and problems elsewhere can definitely impact blood cell production.
Absolutely. Another fascinating example is GATA2 deficiency. This involves a problem with a specific transcription factor, GATA2, which is crucial for regulating the development of various blood cell types.
And just to refresh our memories, transcription factors are like the master regulators of gene expression. They control which genes get turned on or off in a cell.
That's right. And because GATA2 is so vital for hematopoiesis, mutations in this gene can lead to a whole range of issues affecting red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. It's like a disruption in the central command center of the blood cell factory, leading to problems across multiple production lines.
Wow. It's like DBA, but on a much larger scale.
In a way, yes. But there's also a condition called GATA1-related dyserythropoietic anemia, which is much more focused on red blood cell production.
So in this case, it's a different transcription factor, GATA1, that's causing problems mainly in the red blood cell lineage.
Precisely. It's a reminder that even within this vast network of genetic regulators, there can be specific disruptions that primarily affect just one cell type or, lineage.
So it's like having a problem with a specific circuit breaker controlling the lights in just one room, as opposed to a power outage that affects the entire house.
A perfect way to put it. And this theme of interconnectedness pops up again in Marrow syndrome. It stands for amylodysplasia, immunodeficiency, restriction of growth, adrenal hypoplasia, genital phenotypes, and enteropathy.
That's quite a mouthful.
It is, but it really underscores how a single genetic mutation can have these cascading effects across multiple body systems. And in Marrow syndrome, anemia is just one piece of a much larger picture. This includes immune problems, growth delays, hormonal issues, and problems with the gut.
Like a domino effect, where one problem triggers a chain reaction throughout the body.
Exactly. It's crucial to consider the bigger picture when we're discussing any blood disorder, because sometimes what seems like a simple case of anemia might actually be a symptom of something much more complex and far-reaching.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. From the basics of red blood cell production to a whole spectrum of conditions that can disrupt this process. But now let's focus on some disorders that highlight the incredibly precise controls that govern normal red blood cell production. We're talking about nutrient transport, viral persistence, and signaling pathways.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting because it reveals just how finely tuned this whole system really is. You see, it's not enough to have the right genes and the right cellular machinery. You also need the right environment, the right signals, and even the right amount of specific nutrients.
So it's like even if you have the recipe and ingredients, if the oven temperature's off or you don't mix the batter right, the cake won't turn out properly.
Exactly. A perfect example is thiamine-responsive megaloblastic anemia, or TRMA. In this condition, there's a defect in a transporter protein that brings thiamine, which is also known as vitamin B1, into the cells.
And thiamine is essential for lots of metabolic processes, right?
Absolutely. It's a coenzyme involved in energy production and carbohydrate metabolism. And when cells don't get enough thiamine, it can cause problems with cell division and DNA synthesis, particularly in those rapidly dividing cells, like the ones in the bone marrow.
And that's when you get megaloblastic anemia, where the red blood cells are larger than normal and often have abnormal shapes.
Precisely. But here's the interesting part. In TRMA, high doses of thiamine can actually reverse the anemia. You see, the transporter protein might be faulty, but if you flood the system with thiamine, you can force enough into the cells to kind of compensate.
It's like finding a workaround for a broken part.
Exactly. And this really contrasts with DDA, where there's no simple nutrient supplement that can fix that underlying ribosomal defect. In TRMA, the problem's with the delivery system, but the cellular machinery itself can still use thiamine properly.
So it's like a car with a clogged fuel line. You could fix it by cleaning the line or using a higher pressure pump to force fuel through. But if the engine itself is broken, adding more fuel won't help.
Another excellent analogy. We see a similar principle at play with riboflavin-responsive megaloblastic anemia. In this case, the issue lies with utilizing riboflavin, or vitamin B2. It's another crucial coenzyme for energy production. And high doses of riboflavin can often improve the anemia, demonstrating just how important these specific nutrients are for normal red blood cell production.
Okay, so we've seen how problems with nutrient transport can disrupt red blood cell production. What about viral infections? We touched on tech earlier, but can viruses cause more chronic issues in the bone marrow?
Definitely. They certainly can, especially in people who have weakened immune systems. Chronic congenital parvovirus B19 infection is a good example. This virus targets red blood cell precursors, and in some cases, it can actually lead to this persistent suppression of red blood cell production.
So it's like the virus is constantly hitting the pause button on red blood cell production, preventing it from recovering.
Exactly. And this differs from DBA, where, the issue is a fixed genetic defect. In chronic parvovirus infection, the suppression of red blood cell production is ongoing and dynamic, driven by the presence of the virus.
It's like having a saboteur in the factory who keeps shutting down the production line every time it restarts.
That's a great way to put it. The good news is that treating the underlying immune deficiency or using immunoglobulin therapy to target the virus can help restore red blood cell production in some cases.
So another reminder that anemia can be caused by factors outside of the bone marrow itself, like infections or nutrient deficiencies.
Absolutely. And finally, let's talk about signaling pathways. These are like the communication networks within and between cells, telling them when to grow, divide, differentiate, and even when to die. And disruptions in these pathways can have a major impact on red blood cell production.
It's like having miscommunication between managers and workers in a factory. If the orders aren't clear, well, production suffers.
Exactly. A prime example is erythropoietin receptor mutations, or EPOR mutations. Erythropoietin, or EPO, is a hormone that stimulates red blood cell production. It does this by binding to its receptor, EPOR, on the surface of red blood cell progenitors.
So it's like a messenger delivering a message that says, make more red blood cells.
Precisely. However, if there's a mutation in the EPOR gene, the receptor might not work properly, so the cells don't receive the message. And red blood cell production is impaired.
So even though the signal is being sent, the cells can't receive it. It's like having a phone with a broken antenna. You can make calls, but no one can hear you.
Exactly. We see a similar principle in transferrin receptor 2 deficiency, or TFR2 deficiency. Transferrin receptor 2 actually regulates iron uptake and utilization, which is essential for making hemoglobin.
So if TFR2 isn't working properly, cells might not get enough iron to make hemoglobin, even if there's plenty of iron in the body.
That's right. It's like having a warehouse full of raw materials, but no way to get them to the factory floor.
These examples really show that red blood cell production isn't just about having the right parts in the right environment. It's also about having the right signals and communication systems in place.
Absolutely. And this brings us full circle back to DBA. It's a condition where that fundamental machinery for making red blood cells is flawed. But by understanding how these other factors can disrupt the process, we gain a much deeper appreciation for the complexity and vulnerability of blood cell production.
It's like realizing that even a simple machine, like a bicycle, has dozens of parts that all have to work together seamlessly for it to function properly.
Precisely. And that knowledge helps us ask better questions, develop more targeted therapies, and ultimately improve the lives of patients with these conditions. Welcome back to our deep dive into Diamond Blackfan Anemia. If you remember, in part one, we explored the incredible world of red blood cell production and all those different conditions that can, well, disrupt this vital process.
Yeah, we definitely laid some groundwork. And now it's time to zero in on DBA itself. What are some of the telltale signs that clinicians look for when they're diagnosing this rare disorder?
Diagnosing DBA is it's a bit like putting together a puzzle, really. You're combining clinical observations, lab results, and genetic testing to try and get the full picture.
So it's not like there's a simple blood test that just like definitively says you have DPA. It's more like a detective story, right?
Exactly. The first clue often comes from the patient's history, how the illness actually presents itself. DB8 typically shows up pretty early, often in infancy, within
Sure.
the first year of life. And it comes with this severe anemia that just can't be explained by other common causes, like blood loss or nutritional deficiencies.
So, like, picture this. A baby who's super pale, maybe struggling to feed, not gaining weight as expected. That's a red flag, right? Something's up with their blood, and doctors need to figure out what's going on.
Precisely. When they run a complete blood count, they'll see this really low red blood cell count, and it's often accompanied by an elevated MCV, meaning that those red blood cells are larger than normal.
We talked about macrocytosis before and how it can be caused by a bunch of different things. But in DBA, it's kind of distinctive because it happens along with these really low reticulocyte counts.
Right. Reticulocytes are those young, up-and-coming red blood cells. When the bone marrow is struggling to produce red blood cells, well, the reticulocyte count usually plummets.
So a low reticulocyte count in a baby who has severe anemia and macrocytosis, that really points towards something preventing the bone marrow from, well, effectively making red blood cells.
Exactly, and that's when DBA really starts to move up that list of possible diagnoses.
But it's not just the blood counts, right?
Yeah.
There are other tests that can help kind of solidify the diagnosis.
You're right, there are. One that's particularly helpful is the erythrocyte adenosine deaminase, or EAD, activity test. This enzyme is involved in a process called purine metabolism, and it's often elevated in patients with DBA.
So not a foolproof test, but a high EADA level. When you look at it with all the other findings, it definitely adds weight to the diagnosis.
Exactly. Another really crucial part of the workup is a bone marrow examination. While this might sound kind of intimidating, it's really a pretty straightforward procedure. They take a small sample of bone marrow, usually from the hip bone.
And by examining that marrow under a microscope, doctors can see what's happening with blood cell production firsthand.
Precisely. In DBA, they usually see a selective decrease in the number of red blood cell precursors. It's almost as if the marrow is trying to make red blood cells, but it keeps hitting this wall.
So it's like peeking into the factory and seeing one particular production line barely functioning.
That's a great analogy, and this finding really helps to differentiate DBA from other types of anemia, especially those that affect multiple cell lines, things like Fanconi anemia or Shwachman-Diamond syndrome.
So normal white blood cell and platelet counts, but significantly impaired red blood cell production, that strengthens the suspicion for DBA.
Precisely. But the most definitive way to actually diagnose DBA is through genetic testing. It's like looking at the instruction manual for the human body.
Genetics.
Uh,
Unraveling the secrets hidden within our DNA.
exactly. Over the years, researchers have actually identified a bunch of different genes that are associated with DBA. The most common one is RPS19, which provides instructions for making a ribosomal protein. Remember those protein-making machines we talked about?
Those little factories assembling proteins based on DNA instructions. So RPS19 is a key component of those ribosomes. And if there are mutations in this gene, it can disrupt their function.
Precisely. Now, you might be thinking, well, why does this defect mainly affect red blood cells if ribosomes are needed for all cells? That's actually still being researched, but it's thought that those red blood cell precursors are particularly vulnerable to any kind of ribosomal dysfunction because they have this really high demand for protein synthesis.
They're constantly churning out hemoglobin, so those ribosomes need to be running at peak performance.
Right. Even the smallest hiccup in ribosome function can have a big impact on their ability to, produce red blood cells.
So if genetic testing reveals a mutation in RPS19 or any of the other DBA-related genes, that pretty much confirms the diagnosis, right?
It does. And it's also really valuable for family counseling because DBA can actually be inherited. If one parent carries a mutation in a dominant gene like RPS19, there's a 50% chance that each of their children will inherit it.
Just imagine being a parent and learning that your child has this rare disorder. It must be a really difficult mix of emotions. Knowing the genetic cause, it must be terrifying, but also maybe a little bit empowering.
You're absolutely right. It allows families to really understand their risks and make those informed choices about family planning. Now, it's important to remember that not all DBA cases have these identifiable mutations in those known genes. There are still some patients where the genetic cause remains a mystery.
That's often the case with rare disorders, isn't it? There's still so much that we don't know.
That's true. However, even without a confirmed genetic diagnosis, if a patient has all the other clinical and lab findings that are typical for DBA, they're still diagnosed and treated accordingly.
It's a diagnosis based on the weight of the evidence.
Precisely. And this really underscores the importance of having experienced clinicians who are, familiar with this rare disorder. It's not something you'd see every day in a general pediatrician's office.
So it's often beneficial for patients to be seen at these specialized centers, the ones with expertise in DBA and other rare blood disorders.
Exactly. Having access to those specialized teams can make all the difference in a patient's diagnostic journey.
We've covered a lot about the key features that clinicians use to diagnose DBA. That early onset of severe anemia, macrocytosis with low reticulocyte counts, the elevated EDA levels, what they see in the bone marrow, and the genetic testing. But what about physical characteristics? I remember we briefly touched on how some DBA patients have congenital anomalies.
Right. About 30 to 50% of people with DBA are born with physical anomalies, and these can vary a lot from person to person.
So it's not like everyone with DBA has the same physical features.
Exactly. Some of the most common anomalies actually involve the thumbs. You might see triphalangeal thumbs, which is where the thumb has 3 bones instead of the usual 2, or the thumbs might be underdeveloped or have a really unusual shape.
So a doctor is examining a baby with severe anemia, and they notice something different about their thumbs. That could be a clue, pointing them towards DBA.
Absolutely. Other common features include craniofacial anomalies like a cleft palate or a small lower jaw. There can also be abnormalities with the eyes, heart defects, and urogenital anomalies.
It almost seems like that ribosomal defect is affecting multiple developmental pathways, not just the one for, making red blood cells.
That's a great observation. And it makes sense, considering that ribosomes are so crucial for all cells, and those mutations in ribosomal protein genes, well, they can have these wide-ranging developmental consequences.
So these physical anomalies are just another piece of the puzzle. Another clue that helps clinicians diagnose DBA and understand, well, its broader impact.
Precisely. But it's really important to remember that while these anomalies are common, they're not absolutely necessary for a diagnosis. Some people with DBA have completely normal physical features.
So you can't rule out DBA just because a baby doesn't have a triphalangeal thumb.
Right. Right. It's always essential to consider the whole picture, looking at all the clinical and laboratory findings together.
Okay, so we've really talked in depth about diagnosing DBA. Now let's switch gears and talk about treatment. What can be done to help these patients?
The treatment for DBA really depends on the individual patient and how severe their symptoms are. But there are 3 main approaches: corticosteroids, chronic transfusions, and hematopoietic stem cell transplantation.
So let's start with corticosteroids. How do they work, and how effective are they for treating DBA?
Corticosteroids are these powerful anti-inflammatory drugs, and they're often the first-line treatment for DBA. They work by suppressing the immune system, which, for reasons we don't fully understand, can actually stimulate red blood cell production in some patients.
So it's not a cure, but it's a way to kind of kickstart the bone marrow into making more red blood cells.
Exactly. About 70 to 80% of DBA patients will respond to corticosteroids to some degree, and that means their blood counts improve, and they might not need transfusions as often.
That's a pretty good response rate.
Yeah.
But I imagine there are some potential downsides to using corticosteroids long term.
There are. Corticosteroids have a whole host of side effects, especially when used over a long period. This can include weight gain, growth suppression, mood swings, weakened bones, and an increased risk of infections.
So it's a balancing act, right?
Right.
Weighing the benefits of improved blood counts against the potential for those side effects.
Exactly. The goal is to find the lowest effective dose that controls the anemia while minimizing those side effects. And sometimes doctors will try to wean patients off corticosteroids periodically to see if they can maintain those good blood counts without the medication.
So if corticosteroids aren't enough, what's the next line of defense for someone with DBA?
For patients who don't respond to corticosteroids or who just can't tolerate the side effects, regular blood transfusions become a key part of treatment.
So it's like a lifeline, providing those essential red blood cells that the body just isn't making on its own.
Exactly. Transfusions can be incredibly effective. They relieve those symptoms of anemia, boost energy levels, and really promote normal growth and development.
But I imagine there are downsides to relying on transfusions for the long haul.
There are. One major concern is iron overload. You see, each unit of transfused blood carries a fair amount of iron. And over time, this iron can build up in the body and actually damage organs like the liver, the heart, and the pancreas.
So it's this double-edged sword. The transfusions are providing those essential red blood cells, but they're also introducing this potential toxin into the body.
That's right. And that's why iron chelation therapy is so critical for patients who need chronic transfusions.
Chelation therapy. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. It involves using medications that bind to that excess iron and help the body get rid of it. These medications can be taken orally or given through an IV, and they're typically started as soon as a patient is expected to need multiple transfusions.
So it's like a cleanup crew coming in after the delivery truck to get rid of all the excess iron.
A perfect analogy, and these chelation therapies have really made a big difference in long-term outcomes for patients who are dependent on transfusions.
That's good to hear. But managing iron overload must be like a lifelong commitment, right?
It is. Patients need to be really diligent about taking their chelation medications and have regular blood tests to monitor their iron levels and make sure their organs are functioning properly.
So even though transfusions can be life-saving, they come with well, a significant responsibility.
They do, but for many people with DBA, they're really essential for maintaining a good quality of life.
So we've talked about corticosteroids and chronic transfusions.
Mhm.
What about hematopoietic stem cell transplantation? Where does that fit into the treatment picture?
So, hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, or HSCT for short, it's actually the only cure we know of for DBA right now. It involves replacing the patient's bone marrow, the one that's not working properly, with healthy stem cells from a donor.
It's like giving them a whole new factory, one
Yeah.
that can actually produce those red blood cells the way it should.
Exactly. And when it's successful, it can be, well, transformative. Patients who have HSCT often don't need transfusions or corticosteroids anymore. Their blood counts go back to normal.
That sounds incredible, but I can imagine it's not, a simple procedure. What are some of the challenges that come with HSCT?
You're right, it's definitely not a walk in the park. HSCT is a very complex procedure, and it comes with risks. It requires a lot of preparation, including chemotherapy or radiation to suppress the patient's immune system.
And finding a suitable donor is not always easy either, is it?
That's another hurdle. Usually, the best donors are siblings who are a perfect match for the patient's HLA or human leukocyte antigens.
Those are the proteins that help the immune system figure out, which cells belong to the body and which ones are foreign.
Right. And if the donor's HLA isn't a close match, there's this risk of something called graft versus host disease. This is when the donor's immune cells actually start attacking the patient's tissues.
So it's this really delicate balance, isn't it? Curing the disease, but trying to avoid potentially life-threatening complications at the same time.
It is. The decision to move forward with HSCT is made really carefully. Doctors take into account the patient's age, their overall health, whether a good donor is available, and of course those potential risks and benefits.
Definitely not a decision to take lightly. But for those who are eligible and choose to have HSCT, it really does offer hope for a cure. A chance to live a life free from the limitations of DBA.
It does.
Okay, so we've covered those three main treatment approaches for DBA corticosteroids, chronic transfusions, and HSCT. But I'm curious about the future of DBA treatment. Are there any promising research avenues out there that could revolutionize the way we approach this disorder?
Absolutely. The field of DBA research is moving fast, and scientists are looking into some very promising areas that could really change how we treat this disorder.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
What are some of those promising research areas?
One that's really exciting is gene therapy. Imagine being able to correct the root genetic defect in DBA, basically rewriting those faulty instructions in those ribosomal protein genes.
That would be incredible, like going into the factory and actually fixing that broken machine that's causing all the problems.
Exactly. And the technology to do this is getting better all the time. Researchers are using techniques like CRISPR-Cas9. It's this really powerful gene editing tool that can target those specific mutations and replace them with healthy sequences.
So instead of just managing the symptoms, gene therapy could actually cure the disease at its core.
That's the goal. And it's not just science fiction anymore. Clinical trials for gene therapy for other blood disorders are happening right now, and it's likely that DBA will be part of those trials soon.
That's really encouraging. What other research avenues are looking promising?
Another area is focused on developing drugs that can enhance ribosome function. Remember, that core problem in DBA is those ribosomes that aren't working the way they should.
So if we could find a way to, like, boost their activity, even with those mutated genes, that might be enough to improve red blood cell production.
You got it. Scientists are exploring a lot of different strategies. Some are looking for small molecules that can, stabilize those ribosomes and make them more efficient. Others are investigating ways to increase the production of ribosomal RNA. That's a key part of those protein-making machines.
So it's like finding ways to optimize how the factory works, even if some of the tools are a little bit, well, wonky.
Perfect analogy. And there's also research being done on drugs that can directly stimulate erythropoiesis, red blood cell production. We talked about EPO before, but it's not as effective in DBA because the problems with the ribosomes, not the signal to make more red blood cells.
Right. But researchers are looking for new targets, maybe something downstream of the ribosome, something that can be uh, manipulated to increase that red blood cell production.
Yeah. It's like finding an alternate route in the factory, bypassing the broken machine that's creating the bottleneck.
I see. Are there any research efforts that are focused on minimizing the impact of DBA, even if they can't completely cure it?
Absolutely. One area of research is trying to understand why patients with DBA have an increased risk of developing certain cancers, like osteosarcoma. If we can figure out the mechanisms behind that increased risk, then we might be able to find ways to prevent those cancers or, treat them more effectively.
It's like understanding how faulty wiring in a factory could increase the risk of fire, and then figuring out ways to, like, install better fire alarms or sprinklers.
That's a great way to put it. There's also research being done on ways to improve quality of life for DBA patients. This could include developing better iron chelators that are easier to take with fewer side effects, or finding ways to minimize those long-term complications from chronic steroid use.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, tackling the disease from all angles.
Exactly. And that's what makes me so optimistic about the future for DBA. The scientific community is really rallying around this disorder, and I think we're going to see some major breakthroughs in the years to come.
So we've talked about diagnosis, treatment, and the future of DBA. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to touch on the prognosis for these patients. What can they expect long term?
That's a question that weighs heavily on the minds of families who are facing this diagnosis. And the good news is the prognosis for DBA has improved significantly in recent decades, thanks to those advancements in treatment and supportive care.
So it's not the dire situation it once was.
No, not at all. Most people with DBA are living well into adulthood. Many can live pretty normal lives.
But I imagine there are still challenges, potential complications to keep an eye on.
Of course. One of the biggest factors that influences prognosis is how someone responds to treatment. Patients who respond well to corticosteroids, maybe they become transfusion independent or only need transfusions every now and then, they generally have a better outlook in the long run.
But even if they need those chronic transfusions, as long as they have good iron chelation therapy, they can still do well, right?
Yeah, they can. But there's always a risk of complications from iron overload, even with the best chelation therapy.
And what about that increased risk of cancers we were discussing earlier?
That's another concern. People with DBA do have a slightly higher chance of developing certain cancers, especially osteosarcoma, which is a type of bone cancer, and acute myeloid leukemia. It's definitely something that needs to be monitored closely throughout their lives.
So those regular checkups, blood tests, and sometimes even imaging studies, those are all really important for catching any problems early on.
Exactly. And then there's the impact on quality of life, too. Living with a chronic illness like DBA can be tough, both physically and emotionally. Patients might experience fatigue, pain, feeling socially isolated and anxiety about their health.
Addressing those aspects of the disease is so important as well.
Absolutely. It's vital to provide psychological support, connect patients with support groups, and just help them navigate the challenges of living with, a rare disorder. Those are all essential parts of good care.
So, although the prognosis for DBA has come a long way, it's still a complex condition with potential long-term challenges.
It is. But it's really important to remember that each patient's journey is unique, and their individual prognosis depends on a lot of things, including their specific genetic profile, how well they respond to treatment, and their overall health.
So there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to DBA.
Exactly. That's why a personalized approach to care is so crucial, working closely with a team of specialists who can provide the best support and guidance possible.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From the intricacies of red blood cell production to the latest advancements in DBA treatment and even a glimpse into what the future might hold for those living with this rare disorder.
We have. It's been quite a journey.
And, what strikes me most is how much we've learned just by focusing on this one rare disease. It really highlights the interconnectedness of the human body and the power of scientific curiosity.
Absolutely. It's amazing how much we can discover when we take a deep dive into, even the rarest corners of human biology.
So thank you for guiding us through this complex topic. Your expertise has been invaluable.
My pleasure. It's always exciting to share this knowledge and hopefully inspire others to learn more.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Diamond Blackfan Anemia. We hope you found it informative and, well, maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep those questions coming and never stop exploring the wonders of human biology.